Hello and welcome. Before we start, a few words about what I'd like this channel to be. I want this to be a channel focused on healthy discussion and information. I want people to think through these issues and ask questions because nobody is born being right about everything. I wasn't, and I certainly don't expect you to be either. Now, if anybody wants response videos or topics they'd like me to discuss, just pop it into the comment section and I'll try and get to it as soon as I can. So without further ado, this week we'll talk about socialism. Seeing as it's a hot topic in the United States due to the recent election there and in my home in the United Kingdom, it's worth having a discussion about what exactly socialism is. Socialism, that's just communism, right? In that, you would be wrong, because the differences are vast and span the entire spectrum of politics, from the centre right the way out to the far left. The general idea that underpins communism, and I will go into more detail on that in a video about communism later, is that communism is about controlling the means of production and the means of consumption. So we as a society decide not only how much produce to make, but also on how much produce gets allocated to people. Socialism is about transferring the means of production to the workers who do the production. It's a subtle difference, but that's the main idea that underpins socialism. As a result, socialists tend to be very ambiguous on market structures. Some of them will work within markets, some will seek to render them irrelevant, and some will even seek to destroy markets. This is obviously a vastly different picture from what we're led to believe by media outlets such as the Daily Mail or Fox News, or political parties such as the Conservatives or Republicans. Another key tenet of socialism is that the state, that is, the vital organisational structures of the country, must be made to work for the people of the country. It's an ideological tradition stretching back centuries on how power and the state interact, from Plato's Republic to the heavings of ancient Rome to Louis XIV's L'État c'est moi, to Rousseau's social contract, to nascent nationalism in the 19th century. The idea of who the state belongs to and who the state works for has been in continual development for most of recorded history. Socialism is of the idea that the state must work for the people of the country. It's the starting base for all of its ideas, and in that, socialism has a lot in common with many other ideological trends, such as nationalism or social liberalism. How they define and implement their ideas is how the theories diverge. For example, socialists believe in universal healthcare. Now, putting aside the evidence based arguments on the benefits and drawbacks and focusing just on the idea itself, the reason is pretty simple. Healthcare is a right and what you would call something unavoidable. When you need a doctor, you need a doctor and can't negotiate around because your negotiating position simply doesn't exist. You either need care or you don't. Therefore, it is fundamentally wrong to put a market structure in place that assumes that you can negotiate. It is the duty of the state, on behalf of the people, to create a system where the people of a country are able to access healthcare. The main response to this from Conservatives is that if you purchase insurance, then you won't get into bother because you have in essence planned for that metaphorical rainy day. Sadly, this doesn't bear out, not only because we all need healthcare at some point or another, so there can never be a no claims bonus that keeps the price down. It doesn't reflect the fact that needing healthcare is not something that is ever properly negotiable. You can't legally cover every single eventuality, and the profit motive means the incentive is always there to cut corners, and that results in worse care. This is something we frequently see in the United States, where the biggest cause of bankruptcy is medical bills, and it is a frequent topic of conversation and fundraisers about how insurance won't cover some necessary treatment. Of course, people like Senator Rand Paul talk about conscripting doctors, but universal healthcare doesn't prohibit private healthcare. It just doesn't allow people to die or go bankrupt because of their medical bills. This can be implemented in a number of different ways. You've got Britain's NHS, which is paid for through direct taxation and will never ever issue a medical bill. You've got the French insurance system, which is part contribution and part refunded by the state, or Canada's single payer system, and so on and so on. Each system has its unique drawbacks and strengths, but the central principle is always the same. The state acts for the workers by providing them healthcare. I'll do another video at a later date that examines more closely the arguments over universal healthcare. On the economy, socialists try to maneuver away from the structures that create large private entities. This takes a variety of different shapes, from outright nationalisation to incentivising co-ops to trying to regulate out capitalism. For example, Germany mandates that the workers of businesses must have representation on the board to ensure that workers and unions are part of the decision-making process. Other solutions are the co-op model, where companies are owned by the workers who work there and share votes for who is the CEO and the direction in which the company moves. They are all paid dividends as workers in the cooperative. Other attempts look at antitrust or competition laws to make sure big companies don't have undue influence. Other socialists are content to work within the existing structure of privately owned companies, but seek to delineate strict lines to prevent them from exerting too much political power. Others, instead, seek to remedy the inherent inequality of capitalism through taxation. This is similar to the Keynesian approach to economics, and this fracture point is one of the biggest dividing lines on the left. Within the UK, this can be seen between the approach of those who are called Blairites and those who are called hard left, but aren't really hard left. Another similar divide is between the supporters of the Green New Deal, Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, and your more traditional Clintonite Democrats. This division being on the idea of whether socialists should, for the short term, focus on managing out the wrinkles within capitalism, or instead, if they should seek to transform capitalism immediately. The approaches vary, but the underlying point that links the most extreme socialist to Tony Blair or Bill Clinton is one simple and inherent principle: the belief that the economy must work for the people who create the wealth, the workers. Another fundamental tenet of socialism is the goal of reducing class barriers. This is also a goal of many capitalist systems, which seek to implement a meritocracy. Whilst the words class barriers are rarely ever mentioned by a proponent of capitalism, it's something both ideas share because it damages the idea that both systems wish to implement, that you can be anything. Socialists tend to view this systemically, that the traditional barriers and institutions must be dismantled on a systemic level, otherwise the appearance of meritocracy will continue to hide the real barriers. This is very similar, in theory and practice, to how sociologists state systemic racism or sexism operates. For example, in the United Kingdom, having an Essex accent or a Scouse accent will count against you when being hired in certain positions. It will never be overtly said, but you'll hear questions about fitting in or whether you're right for a certain place. This obviously doubles up when you've got a non-white skin colour or are obviously foreign. Socialists aim to tear down these barriers across a multitude of ways. Some focus on education and pouring funding into education so that nobody can ever claim that the working classes are not educated enough to do the more stereotypically high-class jobs. Others secure legislative reform, which works hard to eradicate systemic lockouts by making hiring policies more transparent. Others will seek to enact quotas that force companies to introduce minorities and marginalised people into their companies as a visible demonstration that they can in fact do the job. It is rare indeed that there are no qualified people of any grouping, and it is far more common that our perceptions of them not being able to do the job influences that decision far more than their qualifications. We are, for example, well aware that even with all of the equality legislation in place, a CV with a white English-sounding name will get far more responses than the exact same CV with a foreign or brown-sounding name. At every turn, socialists do their best to remove these institutional barriers, because in traditional socialist theory, class trumps all. Being wealthy and brown will include you, while someone being white and poor would never be accepted. People who follow old socialist theory will point to someone like Priti Patel, the current Home Secretary of the United Kingdom, as an example of this in today's world. However, as socialist theory has diffused across society, it has developed different viewpoints. For example, feminist socialist theory will focus on creating more cooperative institutions rather than the traditional top-down institutions, and will centre on ensuring that true equality of all sexes and genders is present rather than simple class equality, because as we've learned, class equality doesn't mean that inequality is eradicated. Often socialists are criticised for a variety of reasons, and I believe it is fair to address those criticisms. Many stem from misconceptions of what socialists want or actually stand for. Though I'll do a more in-depth video on this later, let me start by just saying no, the Nazis weren't socialist. They hated socialists and gassed trade unionists and lefties, believing they were part of the Jewish conspiracy. So let's just leave that there and move swiftly along. One of the biggest criticisms, often from people in the United States, is that socialism results in less freedom. But then it comes to a question of what freedom? Are you truly free if your choices are dictated to you by a lack of circumstances? And I don't mean that facetiously. It's a genuine thought to consider. Are you truly free if a company tells you when to get up and because of low wages forces you to work 40, 50, even 60 hours a week to earn just enough to be broke? Much of that belief of freedom is set up on the freedom to harm those who have harmed you. But I suppose if you look at it, it sets up an inverse, because those who are free to harm are also free to be harmed. And we see that trend increasingly in the United States. We see a lot of people in rural communities and the more agricultural states who have what they describe as the most freedom-respecting laws. But what that has resulted in is the rapacious plunder of people's lives, as all manner of unscrupulous people attempt to use the space left by the law and the state to make a quick buck over other people's well-being. Now you could say that's because people fantasize about being the rich person who gets to be an ass, but nobody can disrespect them because they have the money and so the power. The problem is that not everybody will have that money. So is it right that the people without means are treated as lesser? Socialists say no. Socialists believe that if the state retreats, power won't diffuse down. Private capital will simply move into that void and dictate choices to people and the state instead. This can be seen in both the United States and the United Kingdom, where the state has retreated from exercising overt authority. The problem is that there are situations that can only be fixed or problems that can only be addressed through collective action. National wars are an obvious point of this, but disasters are another. I don't think anybody who has looked at the United States' non-response or the UK's complete incompetence in their COVID response can argue that abdicating responsibility in favour of personal or private responsibility works. Now you may say that this is simply an extraordinary situation, but it is not. Because if you build a system where everyone has to look after their own interests and only their own interests, and then trust people to do the right thing when confronted between short-term profit and general good, you are setting yourself up to be had. Privatisation in the United Kingdom and the United States are extremely good examples of this. In the United States, vast swathes of the prison system are privatised and run by private capital that is paid by the state to house these prisoners. The general logic employed by capitalists, conservatives, and other free market believers is that we can reduce the state's overheads because private capital will innovate to increase their profit margin, thus saving the state money and generating jobs and wealth. In the United States, this is a very commonly held opinion. In the United Kingdom, it's becoming an increasingly popular one. The issue is that it simply isn't based in reality. What in actual fact tends to happen is that these companies underbid to ensure their bid wins a state tender, and they are now left in the unenviable situation of trying to figure out how to do the job without incurring the same costs as the state. This has led to a system of institutionalized corner cutting. For example, maggoty and out of date food being served to prisoners, denial of healthcare, substandard training and wages for guards, a lack of safeguarding, dilapidated prisons, etc. etc. The list of deficiencies stretches on and on, but you get the picture. It is about extracting every single penny from the system, and who cares if a few prisoners get brutalized or die in the process. The problem is that these prisoners will one day be let out of prison and expected to rejoin society. One of the biggest continual challenges for the criminal justice system throughout all of history has been, how do we stop prisoners from reoffending? The dominant and popular perception amongst the public and conservatives is that if you make prison horrible enough, people will simply not commit crimes anymore. Anyone who has ever heard of a Turkish prison or experienced an Indian prison will tell you that this is nothing more than a wishful fantasy. So people are committing crimes and aren't deterred by hard labour. They're being mistreated, vulnerable to sexual assault, and that's not okay, and not provided proper food. When they get out, what do you think their mental state is going to be? That of a positive person looking forward to putting crime behind them and stepping up and out? The answer is rarely. It's probably going to be the same as most abused and vulnerable people, angry, lost, and often without hope. Couple that with not being able to find a job, and you're creating in effect a permanent underclass without rights who are systematically abused by the state and the prison corporation, which has a duty of care towards them. Bear in mind that this will lead to more recidivism and result in more cost to the state in the long run. This pattern can be applied to public transport, to policing, to the criminal justice system, and to healthcare. The list is endless. In the United Kingdom, for example, a company bid to take the cleaning services of a hospital into private ownership. The bid was hailed as saving hundreds of thousands of pounds for the NHS, but when a Member of Parliament looked into the bid, it didn't account for paying any of the cleaners. So that would result in either exploitative work situations or cost-cutting measures elsewhere, in cleaning a hospital, where a sterile environment is vital. These cost-cutting measures are the innovations that we are promised. They are cuts to the quality of the service, and is that justified? That's something that you should ask yourself. Is the cost in accountability and quality of service justified so the state can save a few pounds? Socialists say no and try to keep private capital away from, at the very least, services the state should be providing, because in their view it is the state's responsibility to its people to ensure that the taxes we pay go towards our general well-being, or in other words, the taxes we pay guarantee our right to the pursuit of happiness, even if it may not guarantee our success in that regard. This is a common misconception that rages wild amongst conservatives, the press, and those of a capitalist lilt, that socialists are attempting to guarantee an equality of outcome. This pernicious myth stems far and wide and has no origin in anything truly factual. Even communists don't try to guarantee equality of outcome, because equality of outcome is impossible. What socialists want and try to guarantee is a truly equal starting place for that pursuit of happiness. They don't believe that it is just or right for some people to start a foot away from the finish line, whilst others are set a mile back. Nor do they find it justified that people who don't work are not guaranteed a roof over their heads, food on their table, and avoidance of penury. This nicely brings me on to another major misconception, that socialism produces lazy workers, which is a very easy claim to refute. Out of all of Europe, France has one of the most socialist states, yet despite this front-footed approach to workers' rights, it has some of the most productive workers in the world. The reason for this is simple. They give their workers regular breaks and rest, which keeps them happy and healthy. Happy and healthy workers are more productive in the long run. Many Americans believe that the only way to get their employees to work depends on their working under the constant threat of firing, that if they don't work as hard as possible, they will lose their jobs and therefore their healthcare and potentially their homes. This is obviously quite a myopic, quite a dystopian, quite a cynical view of human nature, and I suppose it depends on how you view your society. Many societies view work as something that we should complete together, rather than something that we should be forced through. Whereas many Americans have this almost Catholic sense of suffering and persevering, even though most jobs are rather meaningless. Many European countries have far more relaxed attitudes, with regular breaks, limiting of hours per week, holidays, and benefits enforced through law, because the view is that if your worker wants to work for you, if they buy into the goal of the company or the benefits are attractive, they'll work harder because the positive motivation results in a better outcome than negative motivation. Where you fall on this depends largely on how you view human work. Do we work to live, or do we live to work? As a lefty, my view of my job is very simple. I work so that I may live. Perhaps if I were working for my passion project, I may instead say, I love my job. But even then, it's something I would pursue even if universal basic income was guaranteed, because it is something I love and find fulfillment from. This should be the aim of every job in society, but so long as it isn't, we should treat workers as humans with dignity and respect. On some level, I feel it's a case of we had to suffer through this, so should you, from the older generations. To complain against a negative system is transferred as a direct criticism of people who have suffered, because it makes them feel like they have suffered needlessly, and there are few things worse to people than needless suffering. We tell ourselves that we have carried this burden because it is for something, it is in pursuit of something. We transform our hellish life into something noble, that we, by sacrificing like this, are pursuing something greater. To some, it will be the greater good of the nation. To others, it will be the greater good of their future career. And to others still, for their future family. And they can tell themselves that when I've made it, this suffering will have been worth it. Of course, that isn't what socialists are saying. They're not saying your suffering is meaningless. They're saying it shouldn't be necessary, that it isn't right for you to have to suffer to be prosperous. It's also worth saying that if we all made it, that would be communism. So, is it just for people to not have healthcare, or lose their homes, or not be treated with dignity because they didn't make it? One of the biggest misconceptions is that socialism is economically illiterate and has never worked anywhere. The problem with this is that most economies, from Europe to Asia, are mixed economies with elements of socialism included. The most prosperous time in European and American history was the period from the 1950s to the 1970s, which was a period marked by strong economic growth, high tax rates, lots of nationalisation, and tight regulations on companies. Does that sound familiar to you? Most of Europe's economies are heavily mixed, with France, prior to Macron, and the Scandinavian countries retaining the most state control. These countries are some of the best places to live in Europe. It's telling that the most capitalist of all the European countries, the UK, has nearly all of the poorest places in the EU and some of the least happy people. And this brings me to my last point, the moral judgment of socialism as evil. Often, this is rooted in some deeply conservative mishmash of religion, founding narratives, and a belief in freedom. We've already spoken about freedom, and the religious point doesn't really bear much worth, as the early Jews, Christians, and Muslims were pretty much proto-communist in their outlook. So where does this come from? It comes from the Cold War, when the United States was falling behind the Soviets in the 50s, and Eisenhower needed something to rally the US populace around. That something was God, and the belief of God supporting the moral US against the evil, atheist Soviets. Ultimately, it falls down to what you consider more evil, that you have to live within a society bound by rules and have to contribute based on your ability, or that you are able to live free of these rules and contributions, but as a direct consequence, People will starve needlessly, people will suffer needlessly, and people will die needlessly. We're now treading onto the more philosophical, so I leave it on a question to ask yourself. Are you opposed to socialism because you believe it will take away your freedom, or because, when you've made it, it will take away your freedom to inflict suffering on those who have wronged you? It comes down to how you view society. Do you want to live in a world where the top dogs can do whatever they want, for better or worse, or would you prefer to live in a world where the exercise of power is restrained so that we collectively can look for the good as we together decide it? I hope I've given you lots to think on. I thank you for listening, and hopefully I'll see you back next week where I'll discuss capitalism. Thank you and goodbye.